Truth and Healing, episode number 8. It is great to be with you, Dr. Buckley. It's great to see you as always.
It's great to see you as always as well, my friend.
Indeed. With Coppin State about to start back up, how you feeling?
Well, this week actually, we've had meetings every single day, virtually, of course, but feeling pretty good. Uncertain, of course, about what it's going to be, but feeling pretty good about it.
All
How you
right.
doing?
I'm doing well. Across Baltimore, we have had some challenges with trash and recycling pickup.
Yeah.
As folks know, unfortunately, the Department of Public Works has had some staff members contract the COVID-19 virus. And I just want to say those folks are heroes, our frontline staff, who are really out there every single day working incredibly hard, especially right now amidst this pandemic. And unfortunately, a number of folks have gotten sick. What we've been saying, though, is that it's so critically important that management at the Department of Public Works communicates when trash is not going to get picked up or recycling, so that we don't have folks leaving their trash out and attracting our four-legged friends and, potentially creating an even worse public health crisis than that which we are already in. So we have been out there, have been in a bunch of neighborhoods, just trying to make sure the trash gets picked up.
Well, I want to say thank you for that. As you know, we just had a block cleanup on my block last week. But because of the matters that you just shared, it's almost as if we didn't have a cleanup because they haven't been able to collect trash and recycling, and so we're gonna have to have another block cleanup really, really soon. But thank you as always for your advocacy. We, your constituents, appreciate you, and we're gonna keep doing whatever it takes until we
Well, I
can.
appreciate you for doing that cleanup. That's, just the more of that, the better. We gotta, it's tough because we are in this pandemic. And so we gotta limit our interactions, but the more participation among residents, the better we will all be. And tonight, I'm really excited for our show, Truth and Healing. For those that are joining us on Facebook Live, feel free to comment something in the chat, say hello. We are really, really, really excited tonight. We've got two exceptional guests, and we're going to get into a topic which I think is really critical to how we think about a healing city, which is the topic of policy and legislation. Because Dr. Buckley, we both know, and you know, that so much of the inequities that we see in a place like Baltimore are driven by public policy, whether it's redlining, whether it's the war on drugs, which morphed into a war on Black and brown communities, whether it's zero tolerance policing and mass incarceration. So much of what we now deal with in cities like Baltimore is the result of past public policies which shaped deeply inequitable cities and a, frankly, deeply inequitable country that we now live in.
Mhm. Mhm.
So we're excited tonight to talk to Senator Carter, who has been a longtime champion for criminal justice reform and for just pushing back on the war on drugs and on harmful policies at a time when it was not popular to do that, as well as Delegate, soon to be City Council President Nick Mosby, who really led the charge here in Maryland to make sure COVID-19 data was disaggregated by race so that we would know where the health disparities were and be able to act accordingly. Your thoughts really quickly on just policy and the role that it plays in shaping Baltimore, Maryland, and this country that we live in.
Yeah, without policy, what do we have? However, policy has the potential to be extremely harmful because, as you just noted, some of those policies have hurt very specific populations. And so it is really important to the sustainability of communities and cities and states that we have policymakers who are aware of the inequities and who are brave enough to stand up and say, no, we cannot allow this particular policy to go forth as written, or who are brave enough, as with Jill Carter, to say, I don't really care about my career. What matters is the disenfranchised people who are, men and women and children that live in my districts, in my zones. And so this conversation tonight, especially considering that this is an election year,
Yes.
when I posted it on Facebook, I said, it doesn't even matter if you are a Baltimorean. Regardless of where folks live, we all need to be thinking about policy, because policy impacts the things that we do, how we live, how we interact with one another. And so I am really enthusiastic about tonight's
That's so right. And just before we bring in our guests, just one comment I wanted to make that you sparked for me. I often hear folks say, "Oh, well, that's political. I don't do politics."
Mm-hmm.
Right? But we're living in a world that is shaped by politics,
Yeah.
and whether it is the politics of fear and mass incarceration, or whether it's the politics of healing and equity and nonviolence and anti-racism, we are all doing politics all the time. And as we watch the Democratic convention on TV, and as we struggle through this moment that we're in, both as a city, but really as a country, that is just so uncertain about its future. I think the role of public policy and how we think about those of us that are really blessed and fortunate enough to get to serve in these kinds of roles, to get to make laws and change how we allocate and distribute resources. I think it is so critically important that we have spaces like this one to both share platforms and ideas and also hold each other accountable, because ultimately it is about the interplay and the exchange between residents and folks who live here and elected leaders, and we need to be held accountable at all times.
And I think that part is key, the accountability of elected officials, because oftentimes voters feel like elected officials are not accountable, that they say they're going to do one thing and they don't follow through. They don't always know how to hold their elected officials accountable, but it is the responsibility of those elected officials to do what they said they were going to do, and voters have the right to call them out when they have not followed through on those commitments and promises.
Indeed. All right, so let's bring in our two guests. Hey, Senator Carter, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Good. So I want to start by having a conversation with you. And the reason I've always been impressed by you throughout your political career is that it's felt like you've stood intentionally on the side of some of the most dispossessed, marginalized people in our city, even at times when that is not popular and has been politically costly for you. And I think about specifically this moment right now where we're talking about defund and reimagine and what it would look like to have a more just criminal justice system, particularly for Black and brown people. And these terms have kind of come into vogue as we think about reimagining and healing and all of these things. 10, 15 years ago, that was not the public discourse, right? So much of the energy among politicians, among elected leaders, was who can be the toughest on crime, who can pass the most legislation to lock the most amount of people up and get the quote unquote criminals off of our streets. I'm wondering if you could take us back to earlier in your career when you were not the beloved Senator Carter that you are now, with your special place in Annapolis, when you yourself were, I would say, marginalized for consistently speaking out against things like the war on drugs and mass incarceration. Take us back to that moment and what that was like, what the politics of the time were, and why you felt so strongly that you had to push back.
That's a very loaded question. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. I couldn't help thinking, and you've kind of touched on it, that I really had to thank you. And based on my background, it still feels a little odd when people within the political arena actually want to invite me to forums and hear what I have to say, because so much of my earlier career, I felt and was actually shunned by the political establishment. There's been a lot of evolution of what the political establishment looks like. It didn't look like this then. When I was first elected in 2002 and installed in office in 2003, I was very much alone. I was then the only Black woman attorney in the House of Delegates and in the Baltimore delegation. My background had been, many people know my father was a civil rights leader that died when I was young, but I carried a lot of that passion for justice from what I knew his struggle to be. And then I went on to become an attorney, and I was a criminal defense attorney, and had been a public defender for a while. And I was very aware as a lawyer, as I was looking at the criminal justice system from that vantage point, that there's something wrong. And it was connecting the dots. Well, whoever those clowns are in Annapolis, like, they're making really bad laws sometimes, but I wasn't thinking about politics. I still consider myself a reluctant politician because I'm not really clear what motivated me to run for the House of Delegates. I know other people prodded me to do it. I didn't want to do it initially. But when I thought about having an opportunity to shape some of these laws that I had problems with, I thought, oh, that's something I'd like to do if I could get the chance. So that was really my motivation. And of course, I didn't really think that I was going to be, solely focused on criminal justice. I really was prompted to office by a minority business group looking at how we could increase minority participation. But I got to Annapolis and I was pretty shocked because I found that there were no people that I could find that thought like me. And getting to the crux of things, very early on, I began to receive phone calls, including one from a law school colleague, of people that were telling me that they were arrested and not charged with anything. And my initial response was, what did you tell the truth? Like, just tell me the truth. You don't have to lie to me. What were you charged with? What did you do? And they would say, no, really, I didn't get any papers. I was held the whole weekend, no papers. So I was like, wow. So then the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council was new. And so I requested data on arrests and charges. And that's when, for me, a great awakening occurred, because the data was right there. The numbers of people that were arrested on a daily, monthly basis that were not charged with anything was astounding. During those years of 1999 to 2006, the arrests were about 100,000 a year. And I always say, anywhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of those arrests lacked probable cause. They were illegal arrests. And so I started, using this term illegal arrest, and I was very much shunned. I mean, even radio, I remember like WOLB, the Larry Young show, wouldn't even let me use the term illegal arrest on the show. So I started saying uncharged arrest. So anyway, the point is, I was motivated by what I knew was right, legal, and constitutional. I also have always had sort of not just a passion for, I feel aligned with people that are victims or underdogs or suffering or not thought of or silenced or ignored It's just my nature to kind of, if we walk into a room and you have the great elite on one side and the underdogs on the other, I'm going to gravitate toward the side of the underdogs. That's just my nature. So anyway, it's interesting. A great friend of mine that you all may have heard of, Sergeant Lewis Hobson, died on July 31st. And I remember speaking about the illegal arrest back then in, what was it, 2005 maybe? And Hop, I called him Hop, said, "You have a lot of courage." And I was like, "No, I don't. I'm just talking about what's right." And he's like, "You don't understand the wrath of the power structure and how much power is going to not want to hear what you have to say." And I can just say Hop was right. So it was a difficult time. And it's actually it's as much as I, Councilman Mosby, Delegate Mosby, as much as I try to run away from it, I can't. And so to tie in with trauma, to be quite honest with you, I feel that I experienced my own trauma and relive it over and over again as we talk about these issues, because I actually do feel that I was traumatized. For one, I was brought up very idealistically, that if we just know the problem and then we'll fix the problem. I was very shocked to be in this political arena where the facts didn't matter, the evidence didn't matter, the argument didn't matter, being right didn't matter, listening to stories of people suffering didn't matter. There was a blind eye turned to all of that in Annapolis because they put law enforcement on a pedestal and we weren't allowed to even question them. And so that was the environment that we had at the time. And the entire political establishment, the entire Baltimore delegation looked at me as some sort of antichrist that just wanted to bring them down. And those were very tough years for me.
So briefly, before we go to Delegate Mosby, just for folks that don't sort of understand what that political pressure is like, because I think we're now in a time where it has become much more both acceptable and even popular in many spaces to openly question police, to we know we had the gun trace task force. We know we're under a federal consent decree. We know we've had major challenges with patterns and practices that have been discriminatory in our police department. But before all that, Senator, you were still out there talking about illegal arrests and pushing back on the war on drugs. Talk just briefly about what that political pressure felt like at that time and what it means to be marginalized within your delegation.
Well, again, I feel like all of my idealism was destroyed. All of my belief in the democratic system and the Democratic Party was destroyed. All of my belief in politicians, really, if they had the information and the knowledge, they would do the right thing. All of that for me was just destroyed. And, I felt bad and depressed because I'm like, I was brought up to believe in the Democratic Party my entire life. My family was very active in supporting Democrat candidates since I was a little girl, running around screaming, "Nixon, Nixon, he's our man. Humphrey, he's our man. Nixon belongs in the garbage can." That's how I was brought up, always campaigning and always believing that we were pushing with a party in politics that was pushing for the right policies for us, that wanted the best for us. And that is just the opposite. Nothing could have been further from the truth from what I experienced. So, I really grew a disdain for politics. And that's why in 2016, I happily resigned from the House of Delegates because I felt they aren't going to move. I am spending years and years of my life here in a body that does not recognize my humanity or the humanity of my people. That is exactly how I felt. And that's exactly what happened, because we had hundreds of people and families come to Annapolis in 2014 and 2015 to make their case for why law enforcement needed to be reformed. And the legislature turned a blind eye and passed no legislation. And then Freddie Gray happened, and they put together a work group of all the people they controlled and passed watered down legislation that they'd been ignoring for those past couple of years. And at that point, I was very disillusioned with politics, but I was at peace because I was like, I tried, it didn't work. I'll move on and do something completely different, maybe have an impact. So that was my thinking about it. But what's interesting is that the people there today are just walking to a completely different environment. And I don't think they could possibly fathom what it was like. For example, in the Baltimore delegation in the House, I remember, this is not on the issue of arrest, but I did have the legislation to automatically expunge uncharged arrest. It didn't go anywhere for a long time until somebody else sponsored it, and then it was allowed to pass. But I remember a little bill about getting the lead out of the water in the schools. The delegation wouldn't support me. I guess because it was me. I'm not, and they didn't like the issue either. And I remember busing people down to Annapolis to be in the delegation meeting to them to vote right. And anyway, Nick, you have experienced it maybe a little bit at the tail end of when it was still really terrible. But they pulled shenanigans where they pretended that they weren't voting for something and it was going to be held for another week. Meanwhile, they sent a letter to the committee that the delegation had voted it down. I mean, those games and shenanigans were just very, very disheartening. And that was the modus operandi of politics then. And I can just honestly say it has improved. When I learned that Delegate Stephanie Smith had become the chair of the Baltimore delegation, I cried, because Stephanie Smith is a Black woman attorney who I believe is brilliant and who goes even further than I do in terms of her knowledge of understanding of many of these issues of inequity and trauma. And I just felt like, wow, this same caused so much pain is now being led by someone that is completely the antithesis of what had existed before.
Great.
Wow, thank you so much, Senator. I want to start this next question actually by pointing out a couple of things that the senator said. So Nick, this is for you. So Senator Carter said that she started her career and was essentially disillusioned with the process. She said, that was a time when facts didn't matter and the suffering didn't matter. And here we are in the midst of this global pandemic. And a couple of months ago, when we first heard about COVID, we didn't even know what the facts were. But your advocacy, right, confronted us and called lawmakers to grapple with, well, what are the facts? And specifically, you wanted the numbers related to the race and zip codes to be released. So can you share more about why it was so critical? And, I'm reflecting because you came and visited my class. You didn't look as clean cut as you look today because nobody could go to the barbershop. You remember that?
I do.
But when you spoke with my students, you gave us an indication as to why we needed to know these numbers. And again, here we are a few months later. So help us to really understand why the numbers are so relevant with respect to Black and Brown people and in zip codes such as mine.
Yeah. So we know that health disparities, particularly in places like Baltimore City with, our socioeconomic conditions, directly affect our communities. It's a personal experience of mine. My father died when I was 14. First person in my family to go to college. All of my grandparents were dead before I graduated. And my mother died the year before I was elected onto the Baltimore City Council for the first time. So when we talk about health disparities, we talk about the loss of legacy in our communities. It's real and it's all around us. What I did not want was for us to look at what appeared to be a global pandemic that we were going into, for us to read a jazzy New York Times op-ed in 2 or 3 years, or for someone to do some white paper at some university in a couple of years to talk about how this virus disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities. I wanted to know what the data was and how that data was used to put out information to engage populations, to provide testing, but then also more importantly around treatment. We knew that the federal government, we knew the state was going to have funds set aside to directly go after impacted communities. Well, if you're not tracking where those impacted communities are, how can you honestly ensure that a proportionate amount of the absorption of that money is going to those communities that are affected? We were also looking at it not just from a disproportionate impact from a health perspective and outcomes, but also from an economic perspective. We saw when the rollout of the first PPP money, the first time we spent hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars as fast as I've known in my lifetime. We know most of that money went to large corporations and folks who had the access. We also know that Black and Brown businesses in Black and Brown communities were hit the hardest, and many have shut down, never to open up again. So again, I'm an electrical engineer by trade. Without data, it's really hard to make an opinion. When our government, whether federal, state, or local, has made opinions and decided to act in the dark, it has always been to the disadvantage of the disadvantaged. And I did not want that to occur.
And I think that was such an important advocacy push because, we're seeing it. Dr. Buckley mentioned in our district right now, where we have a high population of immigrant folks from all over the world, and 21224 has been, unfortunately, among the highest COVID districts in the state. And it's because, to Delegate soon-to-be President Mosby's point, we know that folks have to go to work, that many of our folks didn't get stimulus checks, didn't get state aid, that, when we think about essential workers and frontline workers, whether it is in Amazon, whether it's in the restaurants and the bars, folks are relying on those paychecks. And so having that data disaggregated in that way by race, I think, is so key.
And Zeke, if I could jump in real quick, kind of tie in Dr. Buckley's questions and the response to what the senator said earlier. I want us to be very clear that this time is very unique, but potentially there's a lot of folks that are intoxicated for a sense of urgency now that can quickly evaporate moving forward, right? So it's really important, that, we continue to have these discussions, that we continue to kind of push that advocacy, but we also have that data to ensure that we're holding folks accountable, not just now in this moment, but moving forward. The worst thing that can come out of this is, immediate actions to kind of quell the tensions or quell the frustrations for us to go back to business as usual. And that's something I've constantly tried to stress as well. So be it criminal justice reform, be it health disparities, be it economic paradigm shifts in our most vulnerable communities, these are the types of things that we know structurally have been on top of our communities that have affected them for decades, and it creates the systemic issues that we talk about every single day.
Yeah, Nick, to that very point, I remember back in 2015, after the death of Freddie Gray, and I remember specifically, you were out there, Elijah was out there. I was driving around picking up students. I was still doing Intersection at that time, which was the after school program. And we saw collectively all this energy around that young man's death. And then, to your point, it sort of evaporated. And the One Baltimore project went away. A lot of the funding that had been dropped by foundations, both local and national, dried up. There just wasn't the sort of sustainability. There wasn't the real impact. So I'm curious how you think about that moment back in 2015 versus this moment now, where George Floyd is on everyone's lips, and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, the same patterns still exist. And I'm curious how you think about, given that in 2016 and 2015, we were not able to truly transform those institutions that are culpable for the death of Freddie Gray. How in this moment, as you head into your new role as city council president, as our city continues to struggle through this pandemic, as we saw this new wave of protest where young people really led and powerful and mostly peaceful different ways, how do you think about this moment that we're in now so that we don't lose what you talked about, which is the sense of urgency to create real change?
No, and that's a real a dilemma, and that's a point that takes a lot of collective and organizing around. What I will tell you from those lived examples just 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, is you got to strike while the iron is hot, right? And you got to swing for what we know is right as it relates to what we know has been done that is wrong, right? And I say that because how we might appreciate those words, to kind of Senator Carter's point, do we really appreciate the level of commitment it takes to get that done, even in the midst of a crisis, even in the midst when you have the biggest opportunity for the largest gain? So I say that not lightly. I say that it's still extremely challenging. But again, I continue to remind my contemporaries and folks around me and other elected officials that this idea that now we look behind us and we have so many people part of a party that are able to utilize and utter words like Black Lives Matter, that is finally talking about the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, that will finally start talking about lead paint and the fact that these manufacturers of it that made billions and billions of dollars have not paid 1 cent to eradicate it in a place like Baltimore City, to talk about criminal justice, to talk about it over and over. We know these things. These things aren't secrets. The empirical data is there. There've been bills, there've been advocates, there've been legislatures to do these things. Now is the time, and it's about us to really come collectively to get it done. Again, you got to swing for the fences. You got to strike while the iron is hot. This is no time to just sit back, kind of relax, and watch how this thing unfolds. This is about activism, and it's about now.
Mm-hmm. And activism on behalf of the people who don't have the tools necessary. They don't always have the voice. They know that something is wrong, but they need people like you and the senator to be able to take these issues and turn them into public policy. And so with that, Senator Carter, can you share with us, why did you sponsor the Elijah Cummings Healing City Act? What was it? You talked about your own experience of experiencing trauma, in your role as a politician. So why in the world did you sponsor this piece of legislation?
Well, first, because of leadership of Councilman Cohen, and he talked to me about it and asked me if I'd be interested in it. And of course I would, because the whole problem in legislative bodies like the Maryland General Assembly is that the legislators making the decisions aren't able to empathize with a lot of the persons coming before them. Our legislative body is usually guided by well-paid millionaire lobbyists that represent special interests. Very rarely do we hear from people that are our actual constituencies before the body when it comes to legislation, which just really briefly, I'll just say that the momentum that was there in 2015, in my opinion, with Freddie Gray, well, first starting back with Trayvon Martin in 2012, when the dialogue was about we shouldn't have these fake police officers. I knew that was a problem because that wasn't the problem, but that was a lot of the narrative, is that we need to get rid of those. And then after Freddie Gray, it was about, yeah, we know we need police reform, but people seemed satisfied, with the officers being charged and then the consent decree. And there was no real nexus between that and policy. What I see different this time is what Delegate Mosby said, which is that immediately the conversation is centered around the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, and legislative leaders have said they're going to address that issue. But back to what you're saying, it's important because of that lack of ability to empathize and have any kind of a connection with the people that are experiencing the weight of government policies on them, that are designed to not help them, but too often harm them. We've had such a slew, and our Baltimore delegation has been very responsible for a lot of bad policies over the years that have further, created the trauma. Trauma is a new word for me to use. I'm used to talking in terms of oppression, and disparity and inequity, racism, and the economic, the representative body for many years, in my opinion, didn't recognize the plight of poor people. And so that's why, in recent years, there's been an evolution of the concept of the criminalization of poverty. And so I think that's one of the greatest examples of the best illustrators of a problem. The fact that, our policies, and many of us, not me, but many of the policies that have been put forth have been, to criminalize people because they didn't have the money to pay child support, to criminalize people because they didn't have the money to pay their car insurance, to criminalize people because they didn't have the money to pay their traffic tickets and their license became suspended and they couldn't drive legally to get to work or get around or to transport their families because of they didn't have the money to pay the bills. And even I remember our delegation passed legislation that if you haven't paid your taxes, you can be arrested on a warrant because of a tax debt. I mean, stuff like that. I don't think that in passing those kinds of laws, there's an understanding of the plight of people, that they're not intentionally not doing something. They're doing something to harm us. They're doing the best that they can with what they have to work with. And let's not forget, particularly in Baltimore City, you have generations of people that have had nothing. They've had no chance. They've had environmental injustice. They've had the lead poisoning. They've had the pollution. They've had no good educational system. They've had no community resources. They've had absolutely nothing. And so to ignore the fact that policies put people in that plight and then not be sensitive to how we figure out how to fix this turnaround and get them out. And then on top of insult to injury, so not only do you put people in a hopeless situation where there's no chance of coming out of it without being dead or in the criminal milieu or in the criminal justice system. Then on top of it, you further condemn them with more oppressive laws, not just the regular laws, but then we got to increase the mandatory minimum. If someone in Baltimore City right now is charged with being in proximity to a gun or in possession with a gun, there's about 10 different charges that'll be lodged against them just for that one thing. So that we're still doing it, is my point. And so I want any opportunity, particularly through this legislation, I want any opportunity to shine a light on the real plight of people, the trauma that people go through. But more than that, I want us to look at policy through the lens of trauma so that we can begin to help people and help fix the problems, and to use Zeke's terms, to heal the people, to heal the city, to heal the state. So that's the reason.
And Senator, I greatly appreciate your partnership and sponsorship of that law. And very much to your point, when we did the original bill on the city, it came out of a hearing that we held related to violence facing our children. And specifically, it was the shooting that took place at Frederick Douglass High School, inside the school. And I remember at the time, so much of the adult public discourse was around, should school police be armed, right? Remember, the school board and then the legislature all sort of took that up. And that's what everyone wanted to talk about, was if we had just had a guy with a gun, a good guy with a gun, could we have prevented the bad guy with the gun from coming and shooting the other, so that was the conversation. We held this hearing, and my expectation is that is what we were going to talk about, is how to harden the target of our schools. But the most powerful and compelling testimony by far came from these three young people, Brianna, Jayana, and Damani, who said, look, you've got it all wrong. You focus so much of your energy on policing and your policing plan. Where's your prevention plan? Where is this city council's focus on preventing trauma, on dealing with, and then they listed every adverse childhood experience, what we call ACEs in the book. But for them, it was not, the jargon of trauma or ACEs. It was, look, when I leave my house and there's a liquor store on every corner, that's not good. When I come to school and I got to go through a metal detector, when I have throughout my life experienced homelessness. And so to your point, it is truly a testament to people actually coming, testifying, creating legislatures, creating bodies, creating laws that center people instead of trying to exacerbate already tough on crime policies that we know have done so much damage. And with that, to pivot, Delegate Mosby, when you were back in the city council the first time, on that same topic, you sponsored a ban the box bill to give folks who had been involved in the criminal justice system an opportunity to work, to get employment, to get back into the economy. Could you talk about why that legislation was important for you? And also, as we sort of started this conversation with Jill, what the political pressures were on you? And I kind of remember it because my students were like there at one point with you. But what the political pressures were on you to drop that bill or amend the heck out of it so that it didn't really have an impact?
That is pretty interesting. You're taking me down memory lane. I remember coming talking to your kids about the importance of the bill. At the end of the day, this idea that we expect folks that have criminal transgressions from 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago to wear scarlet letter around their chest for the rest of their life and literally and openly be discriminated against. If we're serious about rebuilding our city, if we're serious about reducing crime, we must be serious about going after and holistically tackling recidivism. And you can't tackle recidivism without providing folks a real fighting chance at gainful employment. And that was the entire bill. Now, it was the most progressive bill in the country at the time because it included charges for individuals who completely ignored the law around still going and looking up folks' records. But again, just to explain to the audience, what it did was it basically said, you have to provide everybody that comes into you a fair chance to fight for this job. We know that with applying for jobs, it's our interpersonal skills, it's the connectivity that we make with the hiring manager. It's not just about our resume and sometimes our application. Well, what we knew was that there were computer programs that were going to automatically X out certain applications because that box was checked. We knew that hiring managers had implicit biases that went even deeper as it relates to race, as it relates to crime. So we knew these things were there. So we wanted to eliminate there to provide folks with a fair and equal chance and fight to go after employment because that's how we build, again, our city back. But it got a tremendous amount of backlash. I thought it made total sense. I was able to show the empirical data around the implicit biases associated with hiring managers. I was able to show it. There was a study done by Dr. Dwyer about 20 years ago that compared and looked at men with felony records, Black and white with felony records, and those without, and their educational levels. And the data, it was alarming at best. But Zeke, what I will tell you is that's the first time I had so many CEOs in this city, so many business leaders in this city. In the Baltimore Business Journal, they took out an editorial page about this bill. They wanted to do anything and everything to kill that bill. And I'll never forget, they said, well, we like the bill, but it creates this donut hole in Baltimore City, and basically from a business perspective, the sky is going to fall all over us. I mean, that's how drastic the outcome was supposed to be. Well, that did not occur. We were able to get that bill passed. And then, I took it down to the state and I was able to pass it 2 years ago statewide. So, I'm serious about providing opportunities for folks that have criminal transgressions in the past. And again, we can't be serious about building our city if we're not serious about providing real opportunities where folks can take care of themselves, take care of their family, and more importantly, take care of their communities.
That. As we're nearing the end of our time together, but I want to just spend a little bit of time. We know that in less than 3 months, folks are going to be going to the polls, either by mail or, however. How would you all encourage Marylanders, Baltimoreans to engage in this process? Because we can't afford to just sit at home and bury our heads in the sand. Why is it important? And another part of that question is, how can we be actively engaged here in our city? And how can we hold our elected officials accountable?
Well,
I'll jump right in. You want to go first, Senator?
no, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead, Senator.
I was going to say that, first of all, we're encouraging people to vote by mail wherever possible, wear a mask if you have to go out. But it's important, and people tend to be more focused on presidential elections anyway. It's important because this election is about, people have said this, it's so trite now, the future of our democracy. What I would say is that for me, that even if I didn't care about anything else, I care about the Supreme Court justices. I care about who's going to replace, over the next decade or so, our beloved Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and others. The court is very important. And for me, that's a compelling reason, if there were not 100,000 other reasons to vote in this election that's coming up but I do feel people are already motivated. Everybody in my circles is motivated to get Trump out. Even people who aren't political, get the bum out, get the lunatic out. So I think that's going to happen. Maryland's not a battleground state, so we're going to be fine in Maryland. It's the other places in the country that matter more. But what I think is going to happen, it's important too, in more than 3 months in Annapolis in January. I'm not sure how the legislature is going to be structured, but that is when we will deal with the police reform legislation. That is when it's time to pass the trauma legislation. That is where people must be tuned in, because these policies that we grapple with directly impact our lives. And again, I feel like this time is different because people are making a nexus between their condition and legislative policy and laws. I do believe that, but we just have to encourage that. And one of the things I'm doing, and I'm not tooting my own horn, but you asked the question, very similar to what Zeke is doing over the fall. I'm going to do a series of these kinds of seminars that are political literacy, because I think it's important to begin to educate. Part of our problem is that our electorate is woefully ignorant as to the nuts and bolts of politics, the realities of it. And those are the things that we need to do a better job of communicating.
I look forward to that.
I would just extrapolate on what the senator said. I agree with everything she just communicated. I would tell folks that your public, your political, your social responsibility around the voting process doesn't stop when you cast your vote. It starts, right? And it's really important for us to be engaged, that all the glossy flyers and campaign rhetoric and all the stuff that got us all riled up and cheered and we were supportive of, ensuring that you're keeping an eye on that and holding those elected officials accountable. I mean, I don't think people really understand what it means when someone reaches out to you, be it via social media, or coming to your office, or coming to a council meeting, or to a hearing in Annapolis. That presence and that level of engagement is so critically important. And when we're dealing with the information age in the 21st century right now, and folks may not be able to physically be there, there's so many other means of ensuring that your voice is heard, whether it's through petitions, through phone calls. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So the one thing I stress to folks, particularly when I sign people up to vote, or I know I have a first-time voter, is please don't allow your civic engagement to stop at the poll. Please continue it. Please ensure that you're holding the folks that you're putting in office accountable to deliver exactly what you need. That is how we counteract this idea of folks being intoxicated about the current moment and losing their win as we continue to go, that we have sustainable change. It's not going to be necessarily the folks in Annapolis, the folks in City Hall, but it's going to be the people. The people are going to continue to push this issue, and that's why the people must continue to stay engaged.
Oh, thank you so much. I want to thank all three of you, actually, for being the types of elected officials who do listen and who really are available and accessible, and more importantly, are brave enough to be accountable to your constituents. I personally appreciate that, and I know that I am not alone in that. Tonight was a really important conversation. Thank you for your insights, and thank you for your words of wisdom. I've been reflecting on both of your backgrounds, and I discovered, Senator Carter, that your dad was a social worker. Oh my gosh, social work again, Zeke, another social worker. I, of course, am a social worker, and I thought to myself, even though you were very young when he died, I thought, wow, his spirit of advocacy and commitment was definitely passed on to you, and I'm so happy that you are able to way. And you, Nick, you speak very openly about your background growing up here in this city. And just thank you so much for being such a positive representation of what it means to be from this great city. And so we want to thank you for spending your time with us on this evening as we all collectively continue to engage in the advocacy and the work for healing from trauma. Let us continue to have these sorts of conversations around truth and healing. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, and to conclude, thank you both. Greatly appreciate all of your insights and your hard work. And to what you both said, just so important that folks at all levels participate and engage, and not just in the ballot box, but in the council meetings, in the hearings, in the legislature. So important that we continue to show up in ways big and small, and in the streets. Hope to see the pressure continue. Hope to see the movement be maintained and sustained, because that is what it's going to take for us to be a healing city. So again, appreciate you both for making the time.
And Zeke, please tell your listening audience to fill out their census, get them in. Baltimore City has a very low rate. It's critically important that we fill out our census. This means so much as it relates to federal funding for schools, roads, and everything in between.
Absolutely. Yep. Fill out your census. We were out last weekend pushing in Highlandtown. Gotta do it. Again, thank you to all the folks that tuned in tonight, to the Healing City team, to our sponsors, T. Rowe Price and the Family Tree. Appreciate all of you, and thanks, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.